before recorded history, before empire, before the first stone of any city was laid upon this broken earth. There walked among men a figure so terrifying, so otherworldly in his power, that ancient scribes reached for language they had never used before. Genesis 10:8. 4 words in the original Hebrew that have haunted scholars for 3 millennia. Haya Gibbor. He was a Gibbor, not a king, not a warrior, not a conqueror in any ordinary sense. The word Gibbor, that ancient, shuddering word, is the very same root used to describe the Nephilim, the fallen ones, the hybrid offspring of heaven and earth whose existence shattered the order of creation itself. His name was Nimrod, and the question that has been buried beneath centuries of comfortable theology, the question that Jewish rabbinical scholars whispered and that the Dead Sea Scrolls circle without ever quite touching, is this: was Nimrod fully human at all? Because the evidence, drawn from the oldest texts humanity possesses, suggests something far more disturbing. It suggests that the first empire in human history, Babel, Erech, Akkad, Calneh, was not built by a man. It was built by something that wore the shape of one. Welcome to Bible Secrets, Hidden History. Before we unseal these ancient archives, consider joining this community of seekers. Subscribe if you believe this history deserves to be preserved, and if this truth deserves to reach those who hunger for it. A simple like is how it travels. Now, let us descend. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Lineage. To understand Nimrod, one must understand what he inherited. The bloodline. He was the son of Cush, grandson of Ham, great-grandson of Noah, the one man on earth whom God declared righteous, the one vessel through whom humanity was meant to begin again, clean and uncorrupted, on the far side of the flood. That promise lasted exactly 3 generations. The Hebrew text of Genesis 10:9 describes Nimrod as Gibbor Tzayid Lifnei Adonai, a mighty hunter before the Lord. Most modern translations render this peacefully: a great hunter, perhaps a provider of meat, a rugged outdoorsman of the ancient world. But the rabbinical tradition, specifically the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, one of the oldest Aramaic translations of the Torah, renders this passage with startling violence. In that text, Nimrod is not a hunter of animals. He is a hunter of the sons of men, one who ensnared human souls, who trapped the minds of men and turned them away from the God of their fathers. The Talmud, in Tractate Eruvin, states plainly, Nimrod caused all the world to rebel. Limrod, against God. His very name is a declaration of war against heaven. This was not a man who fed his village. This was a man, or something masquerading as a man, who devoured civilizations. Now consider his genealogical position. Ham, his grandfather, had committed a transgression so grievous aboard the ark that Noah pronounced a generational curse over Ham's son Canaan, a curse that rippled forward through time. But Nimrod did not emerge from Canaan. He came through Cush, which meant, in the understanding of the ancient world, that he carried the corrupted inheritance of Ham, but without the direct curse. He was, in a sense, the unrestrained expression of that corruption. The curse had a leash. Nimrod had none. And then there is the question that the Book of Jasher, referenced twice in the canonical Old Testament, in Joshua and 2 Samuel, answers in terms almost too explicit to ignore. The garments. The Book of Jasher, chapter 7, records that Nimrod possessed the garments of skin that God had made for Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. These were not ordinary clothing. These were divine artifacts, coverings made by the hand of God himself, passed down through the antediluvian patriarchs, carried through the flood on Noah's ark, and then stolen stolen by Ham and inherited by Nimrod. When Nimrod wore those garments, the text says, animals fell prostrate before him. The beasts of the earth submitted. The people who witnessed this spectacle saw not a man clothed in animal skin. They saw a figure invested with primal, pre-fall authority. They saw something that appeared to carry divine favor. And so they made him their king. Chapter 2. The Nephilim Inheritance. To understand why Nimrod's very existence constitutes a theological rupture, one must understand what the flood was meant to accomplish. The Nephilim. Genesis 6 records the union of the Beni Ha-Elohim, the sons of God, with the daughters of men. The offspring of that union were the Nephilim, giants, men of renown, creatures of catastrophic physical and spiritual power whose corruption had poisoned the genetic inheritance of humanity so thoroughly that God declared the entire project irredeemable. All flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. The flood was not punishment in the conventional sense. It was a purge, a divine reset of the human genome itself. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered at Qumran in 1947 lies a fragmentary text called the Book of Giants. It predates the Common Era by centuries, and it records the names, the deeds, and the ultimate fate of the Nephilim, not as mythology, but as chronicle. One of the giants named in this text is Gilgamesh, the same figure who appears in Mesopotamian epic tradition as a being described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a builder of cities, a hunter without equal, a king who preceded all kings. The parallels to Nimrod are not coincidental. They are the same archetype rendered in two different traditions, Hebraic and Mesopotamian, describing what appears to be the same category of being. Now, the critical theological question: if the flood eliminated the Nephilim bloodline, how does a figure with Nephilim characteristics appear in the generation of Noah's great-grandchildren? Three answers emerge from the ancient texts. The first, Ham's transgression aboard the ark, described in some rabbinical traditions as a sexual violation, may have introduced a corrupted genetic inheritance through an act committed in secret above the drowned world. The second, the Book of Enoch, chapters 15 through 16, records that the spirits of the Nephilim, though their bodies perished, did not perish with them. They became what Enoch calls evil spirits upon the earth, incorporeal, seeking embodiment, seeking vessels through which to operate once more. The third, and most unsettling, some lineages simply survived. Not every strand of corruption was severed. The flood covered the earth, but the earth, once emptied, was repopulated by the descendants of three men whose own spiritual purity was, at best, inconsistent. Nimrod did not appear from nowhere. He appeared from exactly where the ancient texts said something like him would appear, from the broken branch of a corrupted tree, from the unguarded inheritance of a man who sinned when no one was watching. And he emerged, as the Book of Jasher records, with supernatural strength, with the ability to command animals, with a countenance so formidable that those who looked upon him could not refuse him. Gibbor, the same word, the same blood, the same ancient corruption, resurrected. Chapter 3, the Tower and the Divine Decree, Babel. Genesis 11, the most compressed account of civilizational catastrophe in all of Scripture, 19 verses. And within those 19 verses, a project so dangerous that God himself descended to intervene. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people with one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them." Read that slowly. The God who created the universe, who set the stars in their courses, who ordained the foundations of the earth, looked upon a construction project and said, "If we do not stop this, nothing will be impossible for them." What manner of tower provokes such a response? The word Babel in Hebrew means confusion, but in Akkadian, the language of the civilization Nimrod built, it means Bab Ilu, gate of God. This was not a monument to human pride in the conventional sense. This was an attempt to engineer a portal. The Mesopotamian ziggurat was not merely an architectural achievement. It was a cosmological instrument, a mechanism designed to collapse the boundary between the earthly realm and the divine. The ancient Sumerian texts describe the original ziggurat of Eridu, the first city, which many scholars identify as the precursor to Babel, as a structure built specifically to attract the descent of the divine council, to compel the gods downward. Nimrod was not building toward heaven out of arrogance. He was building a mechanism for the gods to come down. And this, in the theological framework of Genesis and Enoch and the Dead Sea Scrolls, is precisely the catastrophe the flood had been designed to prevent. The commingling of divine and human. The reopening of the breach that the Watchers had first torn in the antediluvian age. Nimrod, carrying Nephilim blood, wielding pre-fall garments, commanding the submission of all flesh, was attempting to reconstitute the world that existed before the flood, not as an act of rebellion against God, as an act of devotion to a different God entirely. The divine decree came swiftly. Languages shattered. The unified tongue of humanity, that primordial language in which, according to rabbinical tradition, every word carried power, in which names held metaphysical force, was fragmented into the cacophony we still inhabit today. And Nimrod's empire dissolved, not through military defeat, not through plague or famine, through the destruction of communication itself. The tower fell not because its stones collapsed. It fell because the men building it could no longer understand each other's voices. Chapter 4. The shadow that remains. History did not end at Babel. Nimrod vanished from the biblical text after Genesis 10. But his shadow extended forward across millennia in ways that deserve far more than casual acknowledgement. Flavius Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, whose Antiquities of the Jews preserved traditions far older than himself, writes of Nimrod with chilling precision. He records that Nimrod persuaded his generation that their happiness was owed to himself alone and not to God, that he transformed his governance into a tyranny, that he declared this was the only way to live, in defiance of heaven, with a man as the mediating authority between the human and the divine. Josephus understood what Nimrod represented. Not merely a political tyrant, not merely a builder of impressive cities. The first systematic attempt to replace God with a human intermediary. The first empire built on the principle that a being of extraordinary power, bloodline legitimacy, supernatural authority, divine artifacts, could substitute for the Creator himself. This pattern did not die at Babel. It was replicated in Egypt, where the Pharaoh was declared a god incarnate. In Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar, who built his own tower and demanded worship. In Rome, where emperors accepted divine titles without hesitation. And in traditions far removed from the ancient Near East, across cultures that had no contact with one another, the same archetypal figure appears. The giant hunter king who bridges the human and the divine, who builds toward heaven, and who is ultimately undone by the very power he sought to command. Carl Jung called these patterns archetypes, universal expressions of the human psyche. The Book of Enoch called them something more specific. It called them the works of the Watchers, perpetuated through their children. unto the end of the age. Conclusion. The weight of the forgotten. What does it mean, truly mean? That the first empire in human history was built by a being whose very genetic inheritance defied the post-flood order of creation. It means that the impulse toward centralized power, toward the worship of a singular human authority, toward the construction of monuments that reach toward heaven. This impulse was never merely political. It was, from its very first expression, theological. Nimrod did not simply build cities. He built a competing vision of creation, a world in which the boundary between heaven and earth was not a divine decree to be honored, but an obstacle to be demolished. A world in which the bloodline of the Watchers, suppressed but never fully extinguished, could once more walk openly upon the earth, commanding the submission of ordinary human beings who mistook supernatural power for righteousness. The Tower of Babel was not the end of that vision. It was merely its first interruption. The ancient texts, Genesis, Enoch, Jasher, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Targum traditions, Josephus, they do not present this history as mythology. They present it as a warning, as a pattern embedded into the architecture of history itself, recurring with terrible regularity, waiting to be recognized by those with eyes trained to see it. The seeker who has traveled this far through these archives now carries that recognition. Use it with sobriety. Use it with humility. Because the texts also record this, that every tower built in defiance of divine order has fallen. Every empire constructed upon corrupted blood has shattered. Every attempt to breach the boundary between heaven and earth by human or inhuman hands has been met with the same response from heaven: confusion, dispersal, silence. Babel stands not as a monument to human ambition. It stands as a monument to a boundary that cannot be crossed, and to the God who drew it. The archives of hidden history do not end here. In the next chapter of this investigation, we turn to the question the Book of Enoch raises and never fully resolves. What became of the spirits of the Nephilim after their bodies perished beneath the waters? Where do they operate now? And why do the Dead Sea Scrolls suggest they have never truly departed? That investigation awaits. If you are prepared to descend further, you know where to find us. This is Bible Secrets, hidden history, preserving what others have chosen to forget.